I'm Mike Miller, Program Director at the Social Science Research Council, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to Day 2 of the Conservative Dilemma, Digital Surrogate Organizations and the Future of Liberal Democracy. Today's event and yesterday's are the public-facing components of a 2-day research workshop that brings together an interdisciplinary group of scholars to consider the ways that digitally organized extremist networks may shape the interests and behavior of center-right and conservative parties in liberal democracies around the world. This event and the workshop that complements it are the fruits of a partnership between the Social Science Research Council and George Washington University's Institute for Data, Democracy, and Politics. In just a moment, my colleague Stephen Livingston will say more about the substance of the event and the workshop. But for those of you who are unfamiliar with our work, I'd like to take a moment to introduce the Social Science Research Council, or SSRC. SSRC is an independent international nonprofit organization founded in 1923 and located in New York City. For nearly 100 years, SSRC has fostered innovative research, nurtured new generations of social scientists, and mobilized knowledge to inform important public issues. Today, there are few public issues more salient than the relationship between media, technology, and politics. And the Council is home to a suite of programs that, in a variety of ways, seek to shed light on these phenomena. These include MediaWell, a dynamic digital platform and public resource that curates and distills urgent research on mis and disinformation; the Social Data Initiative, which seeks to improve pathways for researchers to access the data necessary to understand the impact of social media on society; Just Tech, a new council program that informs our understanding of the technological change by foregrounding questions of inequity, social justice, and public impact; and our Media Democracy program, which through research workshops and public events such as today's, fosters new knowledge about the ever-evolving relationship between media, technology, and politics. In each of these efforts, the SSRC's work acknowledges that just as media and media infrastructure can be deployed in service of democratization, accountability, and public empowerment, so too can they be used to promote authoritarianism, surveillance, and disinformation. And so, as media technology continue to develop rapidly, it remains critical that research keeps pace and continues to challenge the assumptions about how media and technology operate in society. We invite you to learn more about our work at ssrc.org. Finally, we are grateful to the Knight Foundation for supporting SSRC's Media and Democracy program, which co-sponsors today's event. We'd also like to thank our tireless partners at the IDDP for their brilliant work. And to our keynote speakers and panelists, thank you for lending your time and your expertise. And with that, I turn it over to Stephen Livingston to say more about today's event. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Welcome to this workshop on democracy and political extremism. I am Stephen Livingston, GW professor and founding director of the Institute for Data, Democracy, and Politics. The Institute exists thanks to a generous investment by the Knight Foundation. This is day 2 of our workshop. For those of you who are returning, welcome. We're delighted to see you again. For new participants and viewers, we are happy to have you join us. Please allow me to begin today's gathering by reviewing some of the ideas we mentioned yesterday, though with some variation in emphasis. But before I get started, I want to once again thank my colleagues at the Social Science Research Council. Jason Rohde, Michael Miller, and Cole Edick are amazing colleagues. They give careful attention to every detail and are always one step ahead in planning. They also brought fresh perspectives and keen insights into the planning of this workshop. So working with them has been a delight. I also want to thank my IDDP colleagues, Elise Meyer and Margot Cunniffe. You are true professionals. Thanks to you both. And of course, thanks to Dean Paul Walbeck for the support of the Columbian College, and also thanks to GW's Provost Office for its support. What are we trying to accomplish in this IDDP SSRC workshop? Let's put aside the technical terms for a moment and once again describe in plain language what we're trying to do. We're trying to understand the effects of far-right extremism on liberal democratic institutions. One kind of political institution stands out: center-right or conservative political parties. As noted by political historian Daniel Ziblatt, who delivered yesterday's keynote address, the emergence of illiberalism or authoritarianism seems to have something to do with the situation that center-right parties find themselves in during times of extreme social and economic inequality. How can these parties appeal to a broad, non-elite public so that they can remain competitive in elections without alienating their core constituency, an economic elite? It is, as Professor Ziblatt noted, a dilemma. Center-right parties often try to resolve it by campaigning on issues that appeal to potential voters from across class divides. They are, in this sense, relying on cross-cutting issues. Additionally, party allies or surrogates, such as cultural institutions, media organizations, and single-issue advocacy groups, help center-right parties draw attention to these cross-cutting issues. When it works, center-right parties come to terms, though perhaps sometimes reluctantly, with liberal democratic norms and practices. Yet there's a danger in this strategy. The most effective cross-cutting issues often involve status anxieties and grievances. This can come to include hate speech if it doesn't start out that way. Party surrogates and cross-cutting issues they push can consume a conservative party and pull it into authoritarianism. Keep in mind that what I have just described is Professor Ziblatt's model for explaining the emergence or collapse of democracy in the late 19th and early 20th centuries in Europe. Now bring this model forward to the 21st century and add online extremist groups that scale and amplify hateful messages. Online extremism is the focus of today's keynote address by Professor Kate Starbird, whom I will introduce in just a moment. But here are our two core questions. Can liberal democracy survive in a period of great inequality and status anxieties that are ramped up by surrogates, including online extremists? If they can survive, how? What's needed? And what can be done by scholars? This takes me to a second point about our workshop. We believe answering these essential questions must be multidisciplinary in nature. Our workshop, including a working group that will reconvene this afternoon, brings together a broad cross-section of scholars from remarkably diverse disciplinary backgrounds. We believe this diversity of perspective is needed as a corrective to a tendency to overemphasize particular causal explanations of disinformation and threats to liberal democratic institutions. Let me explain. For some, the nature of the threat to liberal democracy is found in features of digital technology. It's the bots and algorithms that count the most in explaining radicalization of politics. And of course, it is true that technology plays a central role in fostering political destabilization. Yet placing too much emphasis on technology runs the risk of missing essential historical, social, and political factors that create the necessary conditions for disinformation to be effective. On the other hand, if we place too much emphasis on social and political factors to the exclusion of technology's role, we run the risk of missing the effects associated with digital networks. In short, we need both perspectives. As Professor Ziblatt concluded in his remarks yesterday, a paradox has been added to the conservative dilemma. The democratization of communication channels has made it considerably more difficult for center-right parties to maintain control of the issues championed by its surrogates. This threatens liberal democracy all the more. So I return to the core question of the workshop. Can liberal democracy survive in a period of great inequality and status anxieties that are ramped up by surrogates, including online extremists? To help answer this question is Professor Kate Starbird. Professor Starbird is co-founder of the University of Washington's Center for an Informed Public. The center was formed in 2019 around a mission of resisting strategic misinformation, promoting an informed society, and strengthening democratic discourse. Like UW's IDDP, like GW's IDDP, the University of Washington Center for an Informed Public was founded with an investment by the Knight Foundation. Professor Starbird has written dozens of scholarly articles, white papers, and technical reports, and is a leading expert on the role of technology in disaster response mitigation, as well as on misinformation. We are delighted to have Professor Starbird with us. Professor Starbird, the floor, or in this case, the Zoom link, is yours.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm really excited to speak today and to give you a little sense of where I'm coming from. My background is in human-computer interaction. My department is human-centered design and engineering. I spend a lot of time looking at what we can learn about human behavior online and human behavior more generally by what we see online, and have spent way too many hours in social media data. I am going to try to project some slides here. If you just wait 1 second, hopefully this will work. And I am going to jump into a conversation about trying to unravel January 6, 2021. From the perspective of looking at a participatory disinformation campaign that helped to motivate and mobilize that attack on our Capitol. One place to start with this, there's many entry points, and I went through all of them in planning this talk, but one place to start here is on this now familiar photo of protesters / insurrectionists wandering the US Capitol building on January 6th. This was, among other things, a social media enabled insurrection attempt with symbols and memes of internet culture come alive. Sorry. Another place we can start is here with the view from outside the Capitol with a collection of flags, Trump flags, American flags, Confederate flags, proudly waved by a group of #patriots who had overtaken the US Capitol grounds. Their garb includes the red, white, and blue of both US and Trumpist patriotism, as well as the camouflage and protective gear of military and militia. For an explanation of what motivated that insurrection attempt, we need look no further than the Twitter account of the US president that day, where he repeats the false claim that his sacred landslide victory was stolen from him and his followers, and where he refers to the insurrectionists as patriots. This tweet was the latest in a long series going back to summer of 2020 and even to the election season of 2016, where he claimed that the elections would be rigged against him. Back in early fall, when it was mostly focused on discrediting the mail-in voting process, Bankler and colleagues labeled this a disinformation campaign. We accept the disinformation framing here, seeing this as an effort to intentionally produce and spread a misleading meta-narrative of massive voter fraud. This disinformation campaign was and still is an assault on democracy itself, meant to undermine our trust in the democratic process. It was also much more than a single false claim or narrative. The big lie weaved together many different narratives: the perceived vulnerability of mail-in ballots, accusations that a large number of dead people were voting, a multitude of varied accusations about nefarious issues during vote counting, for instance, suitcases of votes being lost or found, and later claims that Dominion voting machines were shifting votes in mass to candidate Biden, and everything in between. Conducting rapid response research with the Election Integrity Partnership, our collaborative team identified and analyzed hundreds of distinct incidents of false or misleading information about alleged voter fraud, connected to dozens of different narratives. This presentation draws from and extends some of that research. In one sense, the disinformation campaign in 2020 was a top-down effort spread through massive megaphones of political elites to their audiences. The main conveyor of these messages was the former president himself. This tweet, posted all the way back in June 2020, was one of several early posts about voter fraud in this election cycle. Donald Trump claimed that it would be rigged, that ballots would be printed and ostensibly filled out in foreign countries, and it would be the scandal of our times. This tweet received nearly 100,000 retweets and nearly 300,000 likes. By this point in the evolution of Twitter's ecosystem, Donald Trump had a huge megaphone with many dedicated followers who would avidly and often systematically like and retweet his content. And so these numbers aren't surprising. It's kind of par for the course at this time. If we look more broadly across the course of the 2020 election, from summer into November and all the way into December, we find a finite number of repeat offenders who were repeatedly influential in spreading content related to the big lie. Our research team created a list of Twitter accounts that were highly influential or highly retweeted in spreading 10 or more different incidents of voter fraud during the election cycle and afterwards. We also looked at other platforms, and I'll return a little bit later to comment about Facebook at the end. The first thing I want to stress is that these influencers who were spreading false and misleading content about voter fraud were almost exclusively on the right side of the conservative side of the political spectrum. This is a network graph of influencers or highly retweeted accounts in the broad conversation around 2020 elections. So anything about votes, voting, voters, ballots. And this graph shows that both the left-leaning accounts in blue and the pro-Trump sections in orange and red. If we look at where our repeat offenders are in this graph, the accounts that were repeatedly influential in the spread of false information about the election, we can see that they're all located within the red section of this graph. Though some false narratives about election procedures, including content falsely claiming the US Postal Service was purposely sabotaging the mail-in vote, some of these did spread on the left side of the political spectrum. The accounts that consistently pushed this content were exclusively on the political right. If we take a deeper look, we can see among these repeat offenders in blue, members of the Trump family, including the president and his adult sons. They were involved in promoting a large number of distinct misinformation incidents, and almost all, they were among the most highly retweeted of any accounts in our data. In orange, we see accounts of hyper-partisan news outlets and media pundits on the political right. In green, conservative political activists at Turning Point USA, Judicial Watch. In purple, other GOP-affiliated accounts, former candidates or members of the Trump administration and political operatives. And the rest of these influencers are other right-wing accounts with large followings, including right-wing celebrities, social media all-stars, and a few high-profile accounts associated with the QAnon movement in yellow. These and other influencers repeatedly amplified false and misleading claims of voter fraud. They set and repeatedly reinforced a frame of a rigged election through which their audiences would interpret the events of the 2020 election. And so the disinformation in the 2020 election was clearly a top-down phenomenon, but the dynamics of the 2020 disinformation campaign were also bottom-up, with members of the online crowd helping to produce false claims and narratives as well. In part, they did this because they were asked to. The Trump campaign explicitly encouraged its audiences to participate in the Army for Trump, where they would go to the polls and document evidence of potential voter fraud, and then share that through various online mechanisms, including social media. One narrative that emerged from these efforts was Sharpiegate. Issues with Sharpie pens grew to a theory that specifically Trump voters had been disenfranchised by being forced to use Sharpies. This narrative began with a number of people posting stories describing how they or someone they knew or heard about had been giving Sharpie pens at the voting booth, and how those pens had bled through, and how they were worried that their votes may not have been counted. Official accounts attempted to correct these concerns on election day, explaining that the ballots were designed to be used with Sharpie pens and that the bleed through wouldn't affect the vote counting because the bubbles were staggered. But the official statements did little to alleviate the concerns, which grew as more people shared their fears. Initially, the tone of many Sharpie-related tweets was one of concern, worries that the votes wouldn't count, directives to bring your own pen to make sure your vote would count. But as time went on, the content took on a more suspicious tone, reflecting the existing collective belief that the election would be rigged. Eventually, the discourse shifted to the explicit accusation that this was an intentional effort to disenfranchise specifically Trump voters. And this shift occurs exactly with when the narrative begins to take off and sort of go viral. If we look at a temporal graph of the word Sharpie, how it spread in election-related data, we can see kind of takes off on election, actually the night after the election. So, and it was active for a couple of days. So there were a few thousand tweets on election day, mostly of people concerned about bleeding through. But the Sharpiegate narrative, where the right-wing echo chamber begins to coalesce around these claims of intentional voter fraud, that really begins to pick up in the small hours of November 4th, the beginning of the day after the election. Interestingly, this surge here in complaints occurs right after Fox News has called Arizona for candidate Biden. And though the early discourse around Sharpies mentioned several different locations around the country, the focus of the Sharpie Gate narrative becomes Arizona, specifically Maricopa County, Arizona. And so who is driving this surge? Not surprisingly, many of the same right-wing influencers that appeared in our repeat offenders table above, including conservative activist Charlie Kirk and Trump's 2 adult sons. These are folks that amplified this narrative early on as it begins to take off and then spread very widely. This is just one example of many that we saw that follow the same dynamic, where we see this interplay between political elites and online crowds. From this perspective, President Trump and his campaign didn't just prime their audience to be receptive of false narratives of voter fraud. They inspired them to produce these narratives themselves and then echoed those false claims back to them. This echo effect between the grievances of disenfranchised voters, or voters that felt they were disenfranchised, and the political elites feeding those grievances was quite powerful. Social media allow for this two-way exchange between populist political elites and their audiences, these grievance feedback loops. This dynamic has been documented elsewhere. Jonathan Ong and colleagues' work on network disinformation is particularly insightful for understanding this dynamic, which I'm going to continue to talk about here. One second. What became Sharpiegate soon got wrapped up into a larger meta-narrative or movement called Stop the Steal. This term, originally coined by GOP operative Roger Stone in 2016, begins to take off on November 3rd, the Stop the Steal does, so on election day, and continues to be active for months afterwards. It eventually begins to be chanted at gatherings and appears on signs at protests. Soon the Stop the Steal mantra, or drumbeat, as I've heard Dana Boyd and others refer to this kind of slogan, began to manifest as a series of in-person rallies around the country. These rallies were called to action and organized by a collection of established GOP operatives, as well as a more emergent pro-Trump set of more emergent pro-Trump influencers. This is one view of the discourse that was happening around the Stop the Steal hashtag just on Twitter. It's a retweet network graph giving one perspective of the underlying structure of this discourse and some sense of its organization. This two-part structure within the right-wing Twitter sphere has been showing up in many of our graphs since we started making them in 2016. And if we look back further, it begins to develop around 2012. We could see it in the other graph I showed you as well, where the accounts on the right were split into two groups. The bottom section is a cluster of densely connected accounts that repeatedly retweet each other. It reflects an underlying structure generated by conservative political organizing that seems to have started taking shape on Twitter around 2012, with concerted efforts to grow a grassroots network of conservative political activists. That network developed over the last 8 years through grassroots activism, but also astroturfing, automated content production and amplification, and other manipulations of the platforms. For example, they often took advantage of recommendation algorithms and follow-back techniques to grow their connections, creating a rather dense network of mutually following and mutually amplifying accounts. This activity eventually becomes a significant part of the structure of online discourse, at least on Twitter. I talk about how Twitter is wired for disinformation, and this is some of that wiring that has occurred over time. It's consistently present in our graphs, though it's taken a different tone as it expanded in 2020 into a somewhat more diverse network of conservative activists, pro-Trump accounts, and QAnon promoters and adherents. The top cluster of the graph centers around high-profile influencers within the discourse. These are the folks that have risen to the top and they tend to be followed and repeatedly amplified by larger audiences. These influencers include individuals and groups that were organizing the Stop the Steal protests, several political personalities who spoke at the protests, as well as 4 elected officials from the Republican Party, including then President Donald Trump and newly elected Marjorie Taylor Greene. To demonstrate what some of that participation from the elites looked like, here's a tweet from Marjorie Taylor Greene supporting Stop the Steal and encouraging people to sign the petition. At least one case, the petition linked to a fundraising page on her campaign website. And we can see Greene, this incoming member of the House of Representatives, leveraging the Stop the Steal movement to grow her audience and influence and her campaign funds. So it becomes the system that begins to lift her up. So the Stop the Steal movement held a series of protests through November and December, eventually culminating in a grand finale event in Washington, D.C., timed to coincide with the certification of Joe Biden's victory, and accompanied by rhetoric from many inside the movement, including both the leaders and the rank and file, that the movement would somehow stop the certification. Many of the rallies that brought the insurrectionists to DC were organized under the Stop the Steal banner, this idea of this false claim of mass voter fraud. If we look closely at some of the profile descriptions of those participating in the Stop the Steal online activism, we find thousands and thousands of accounts like these, political partisans highlighting their political identity in their social media profiles. Freedom fighters, wives and mothers, military members, Christians, #patriots, supporters of the police, messages that are in some ways, pro-gun, pro-life, often sort of religious messages as well. The accounts also include visual symbolism, American flags, bald eagles, and other patriotic symbols, pro-Trump imagery, memes from the alt-right, military and veteran associations, and here and there, symbols of right-wing militia groups. On January 6th, we can see these social media profiles, what I once described naively as online caricatures of political partisans, come to life in the violent takeover of the US Capitol building. These folks were wearing and waving the symbols of their social media profiles, including the Trump flags and Confederate flags and the camouflage of militia groups that integrated into the movement. Though the analysis I presented here focused on Twitter because that data was public and we were able to collect and analyze it, an internal Facebook report leaked last week by BuzzFeed suggests a similar story from the perspective of that platform. Silverman and colleagues write that Facebook failed to stop the Steal movement from using its platform to delegitimize the election, encourage violence, and help incite the Capitol riot. They describe how that movement took shape through a combination of organic and coordinated action, and they note that right-wing militia groups were active within the movement and shaping that movement towards violence. Stepping back, I want to present a preliminary model of what I and others, including Alicia Wanless, have been calling participatory disinformation or participatory propaganda. Propaganda has always had participatory elements, but online tools that are all about supporting and enabling, connection and participation seem to be facilitating this dynamic in new ways. Presenting a first attempt at that visual explanation, this kind of allows us to explore the dynamics between political elites and audiences in this participatory disinformation phenomenon. And specifically here, the example is around the 2020 Disinformation Campaign. What we saw is that political elites repeatedly spread the message of a rigged election, which set this expectation of voter fraud. This became a frame through which events were interpreted. The online crowds generated false and misleading stories of voter fraud, reinforcing the frame. Sometimes these stories were produced intentionally with knowledge that they were false, but when we really look closely, many of them were generated sincerely through misinterpretation by people who felt that they were being disenfranchised. The grassroots activists, and I say grassroots because it's not exactly grassroots, there's a lot of other stuff going on there. These activists and social media influencers helped amplify these stories. And you can see this kind of, bigger and bigger accounts start passing it up to these political elites who can then echo it back down to their audiences. So these stories move from the audiences up to the elites, and then they get echoed back down. That reinforces the frame, begins to build this collective sense, or the sense of collective grievance. And the audiences echo and reiterate this sense of grievance, violent language and calls to action begin to increase, and we can see this cycle play out again and again. And eventually the political elites begin to mobilize and organize these audiences into protests that become the violent attack on the Capitol on January 6th. So participatory disinformation and perhaps participatory propaganda more generally makes for a very powerful dynamic. It's enabled by social media, but it also implicates the broader media ecosystem. For instance, Gateway Pundit, OANN, Fox News, and others, as well as some members of the political establishment. These tight feedback loops between elites and their audiences seem to make the system more responsive, but also may be leading it to spin out of control. We can see similar dynamics supporting right-wing populist movements all around the world. So my sense is the current conservative movement in the US is now dependent upon and deeply integrated into these toxic feedback loops. Some may feel held hostage to it. Others may understand and embrace that this machine holds the keys to their power. Meanwhile, those committed to democracy convene in various Zoom rooms to try to understand how we put a wrench into these systems to stop these toxic feedback loops. This is the trillion-dollar question right now. And there's this sense on this side to being dependent to some extent, to a great extent, upon the platforms to somehow fix this. On that front, we've seen folks like Maria Ressa begging Facebook and other platforms to do something about these dynamics for years now, since at least 2015. And we've seen the platforms for a long time take no action. For about a year, we've seen them begin to flirt with policies that take limited action. And we've now, in the wake of January 6th, we've seen them take more drastic action, for example, essentially cutting the head off of this multi-headed monster by suspending the account, cutting one head off the multi-headed monster by suspending the account of former President Trump. Actually, if we look at the Twitter side, they took both the head of the monster and a big section of the grassroots part of the crowd that had been manipulating the platform to grow into this densely connected conservative propaganda network. This is that same graph I showed up front to look at just a broader conversation about election discourse on Twitter during 2020. And here we can see in black the accounts that have been suspended by Twitter as of late January. The massive black node right in the middle, if you look really closely between the red and the orange, the two parts of the conservative political networks, that was real Donald Trump, so the president's account. Most of the grassroots section is gone as well. That orange section has been taken out by Twitter. They suspended it en masse. There's barely any orange left. So these suspensions seem to have had a short-term impact on slowing the disinformation grievance propaganda cycle, at least in the US in the aftermath of the January 6th violence. But I'm not confident that these networks won't be built back, perhaps across a different set of social media platforms, and that these cycles won't continue to spin. Clearly, cable news is still turning the gears to keep what it can in motion. And I guess tomorrow we'll find out if Facebook will replace the head and put it back on the top of this unwieldy populist machine. So no matter what decision comes down tomorrow, and I think even sort of short-term thinking about platform change, my sense is that democratic countries around the world would be struggling with these dynamics and their repercussions for years, possibly decades to come. And with that, I just want to thank all the many collaborators that went into the research we've been doing around election 2020, including my colleagues at Stanford, as well as my colleagues at the Center for Informed Public, and turn the floor back over to the rest of you all great folks.
Thank you, Professor Starbird, for getting us started with that thought-provoking talk. Now I'm delighted to introduce the moderator for today's panel discussion, A Changed Landscape, Conceptual and Institutional Foundations of the Conservative Dilemma. Dr. Rachel Blum is an assistant professor at the University of Oklahoma in the Carl Albert Congressional Research and Study Center and the Department of Political Science. Her research focuses on political parties, ideology, public opinion, and computational methods. These interests are showcased in her recent book, How the Tea Party Captured the GOP, Insurgent Factions in American Politics. Dr. Blum continues to explore these themes in ongoing projects on MAGA supporters, factions and primary challenges, political endorsement networks, and congressional communication. Dr. Blum, welcome and thank you.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here, and thank you to Professor Starbird for a wonderful presentation. It is my pleasure to introduce our three illustrious panelists. I'll go through each of their bios, and then I'll have them turn on their cameras. In turn, they will each give about 10 minutes of remarks on Dr. Starbird's presentation or other things that it brought to mind. Then I will leave some time for Dr. Starbird to respond directly to the panelists, and then we'll open up the floor for discussion. So the first of our panelists is Dr. Cynthia Miller-Idriss. She is a professor of education sociology at American University. She's also an award-winning author and scholar of extremism and radicalization. She directs the Polarization and Extremism Research and Innovation Lab in the Center for University Excellence at the American University in Washington, D.C. Dr. Miller-Idriss has testified before the US Congress and regularly briefs policy, security, education, and intelligence agencies in the US, United Nations, and other countries on trends in domestic violent extremism and strategies for prevention and disengagement. She appears regularly in the media as an expert source and political commentator, including recent appearances on CNN with Fareed Zakaria, PBS NewsHour, MSNBC Hardball with Chris Matthews, The Today Show, and Good Morning America, as well as in global media outlets in over a dozen countries. Her most recent book is Hate in the Homeland, The New Global Far Right, published with Princeton University Press in 2020. Next, we have Dr. Christopher Parker, the Stuart A. Scheingold Professor of Social Justice and Political Science at the University of Washington. His first book, Fighting for Democracy, Black Veterans and the Struggle Against White Supremacy in the Post-War South, was published with Princeton University Press in 2009. It was the winner of the American Political Science Association's Ralph J. Bunche Award, and it takes a fresh approach to the civil rights movement by gauging the extent to which Black veterans contributed to social change. A second book, Change They Can't Believe in, The Tea Party and Reactionary Politics in America, Princeton University Press, 2013, with Matt Barretto, explores the beliefs, attitudes, and behavior of the Tea Party. This book won the American Political Science Association's award for the best book in race, ethnicity, and politics. Another book with Matt Barretto, also in progress, is The Great White Hope, Donald Trump, Race, and the Crisis of American Democracy. It is currently under contract with the University of Chicago Press, and it examines the causes and political consequences of Trump's election. Dr. Parker's scholarly articles have appeared in the Journal of Politics, Political Research Quarterly, Perspectives on Politics, Annual Review of Political Science, Annual Review of Sociology, and the Du Bois Review. Parker's work has also appeared or been featured in the New York Times, 538.com, the Washington Post, CNN.com, the American Prospect, Talking Points Memo, the Brookings Institution, Salon.com, and The Conversation. He has also appeared on MSNBC, PBS, C-SPAN, and the History Channel. He resides in Seattle with his dog, Brooklyn. And finally, we have Professor Jacob S. Hacker. He's the Stanley Resor Professor of Political Science at Yale University. Dr. Hacker is a regular policy advisor and expert commentator. He is the author or co-author of 6 books, numerous journal articles, and a wide range of popular writings on American politics and public policy. His latest book, written with Paul Pearson, is Let Them Eat Tweets: How the Right Rules in an Age of Extreme Inequality. Professor Hacker is known for his research and writings regarding health policy, especially his development of the so-called public option. A member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, his recent honors include election to the American Academy of Political and Social Science as the 2021 Robert A. Dahl Fellow and the 2020 Robert Ball Award of the National Academy of Social Insurance. Without further ado, I will turn the stage over to our panelists, and we will hear from them.
I can't remember the order, but I think that I'm next up. Is that right? Okay, good. Just making
That is right.
Good. So thank you. Thanks for that kind introduction. And Kate, fantastic remarks to get us started. Really, really enjoyed it. And especially the framing around participatory disinformation, participatory propaganda, which is going to be turning around in my head for a while to come. So my remarks are going to just be focused on 4 points that come mostly from my position as somebody who spends a lot of time working in testing interventions. And so I want to start by saying that I think, so really I'm focused here on vulnerabilities and what makes people vulnerable to the kinds of propaganda and disinformation that Kate's just been diagnosing and talking about here. So the first thing I want to say is that I think it's important to think of this as not a problem of the fringe, but as a challenge within the mainstream. And the frame that I really like is the German approach to combating extremism after World War II, which they've called defensive democracy. So the idea is that there's always some small portion of extremists within any given society or democracy. The best way to prevent their growth is not to ban and surveil and arrest our way necessarily, but rather to situate combating extremism within the protection of democracy itself. You have to address the vulnerabilities then within the mainstream that make people susceptible to disinformation and propaganda and persuasive extremist techniques like voting and fear-mongering. I think because of the nature of online ecosystems, one of the things that's been really clear is that people in the mainstream are far more likely to encounter extremist propaganda than really has been the case in the past. So where extremist propaganda used to be kind of a destination, or extremist groups themselves were sort of a destination you had to seek out in a backwoods militia or encounter in an Aryan Brotherhood prison gang, or in particularly racist lyrics in the hardcore music scene. It's now much more likely that people encounter both in online spaces where 23% of online gamers will encounter white supremacist propaganda and content while gaming, for example. But even in YouTube, through the recommendation systems that prioritize ever more salacious content, it's just much more easier. It's much easier to encounter this kind of propaganda while you're doing other things or searching for other kinds of content. And so the traditional approach in the US anyway has viewed extremist groups and extremist ideologies much more like a sort of a tumor, as if there are a few bad cells that could be isolated from the rest of society. And if they were just effectively surveilled and monitored and kept away from everybody else, nobody else would get infected. And I promise I was using this metaphor before the pandemic. I have come to think of it much more like a virus that is much more a contagion that has to be contained. And so the approach that my lab takes is inoculation, which is drawing on the same metaphors. We work on attitudinal inoculation, and specifically I've been testing video-based inoculation against far-right propaganda. And we actually have some good results coming out in the next couple of weeks that we'll release that are really promising about the effectiveness of countering persuasive techniques by equipping people to build their own counter narratives to it rather than providing fact-based kind of information. So that's the first thing, is focusing on the mainstream is key. The second is that I think it's important to understand the dynamic that mobilizes people into propaganda-driven movements as one, what I call, that's motivated by a combination of precariousness and entitlement. So the important thing here is that these aren't actually largely disenfranchised groups of people. So not the most disenfranchised groups of people. We know that you're not more likely to join the far right if you're actually unemployed, for example, but you are more likely to join if you grew up with an unemployed parent. So that's what I mean by precariousness. It's the feeling that something could be taken away from you. But importantly, it's not everybody who feels precarious who's vulnerable to the propaganda. It's mixed with entitlement. So what you see as the key dynamic is the feeling that something to which you are entitled could be taken away from you and given to someone else who doesn't deserve it. And that key dynamic is core to white supremacist extremist propaganda that says the country is being lost, the white majority is being lost and being given away to immigrants who don't deserve it. It's key to rhetoric around Second Amendment rights and Obama's coming for your guns, or the Democrats are coming for your guns. And it was really perfectly scripted in the Stop the Steal disinformation, that there was an illegitimate election that had been stolen and was given away to someone who didn't deserve it, to a party who didn't deserve it. It was really as if that script were just, written into the disinformation. What happens with that script is that it's very easily mobilized for some reason that has to be studied, I think, hopefully, why that's an easily mobilized dynamic is really intriguing, but it's easily mobilized into a sense of betrayal, anger, and then a responsiveness to calls for heroic action. So what we see with white supremacist extremist terrorists, for example, is they most often use the language of martyrdom. They see themselves as martyrs, and they see themselves as heroic and heroic activists who are willing to take this final step, who are taking action to save their people, right? So, and we saw the same thing with a lot of the rhetoric around the January 6th insurrection, was that these people really genuinely believed, most of them, that they were the courageous revolutionary actors who were saving democracy. And so it's a dynamic that can easily mobilize and manipulate people into action because it's linked to a sense of heroism, purpose, meaning, and call to save something. The third thing related to that is that as anti-government extremism in this case also intersected with white supremacist extremism, which by now white supremacist extremism has been deemed by our own Department of Homeland Security under the Trump administration to be the most persistent and lethal threat facing the nation in their annual threat assessment. I think it's important to note that it's not just a problem of either anti-government extremism or white supremacist extremism, but they're broader the way that they're situated within a broader problem related to the growing appeal of hierarchies of superiority and inferiority across groups in ways that dehumanize. So it is true that white supremacist extremism is the most common form of that dehumanization in the US, but we also have growing male supremacy, Western supremacy, Christian supremacy, and a lot of those intersect with these anti-government extremist movements in ways that feel very messy and can be hard to disentangle for people. And one significant trend that I think is really important here, and we see it in a lot of the propaganda, is the increasing use of language around a natural order or naturally ordered societies. It's a way of justifying hierarchies of inferiority and superiority based on so-called natural, biological, or God-given differences between groups. And so there's a challenge here in kind of disentangling flat out, straight responsiveness to the propaganda with these other growing kinds of appeals around these hierarchies of superiority and inferiority. One of the ways that propaganda is shared often is by embedding it within frameworks that often appeal to more mainstream or even left-leaning audiences, like around environmental claims. So we've seen a lot of growth of pro-environment or pro-nature kind of language from far-right groups, or groups who claim that being anti-immigrant is pro-LGBTQ, for example, or pro-women's rights. This happens a lot in Europe because of a threat supposedly from Islam that would lead to an infringement of rights to those groups. So we see a kind of propaganda being embedded and carried in other ways that can create more receptivity to it among the mainstream. The fourth and final thing I want to say is that we are, in looking at the landscape of far extremism itself, we're in what I have come to think of as a post-group or post-organizational moment. So we get a tremendous amount of attention to groups within the media and from the government, in part because that's always been the strategy to infiltrate and surveil and monitor far-right extremism and other forms of terrorism and extremism through informants and through infiltration. But only about 13% of global far-right terror over the last 5 years has been caused by individuals who are affiliated with a particular group. And that's true of the January 6th insurrection as well. About 15% of the arrests so far are individuals who are kind of card-carrying members of extremist groups. The vast majority of violence comes from people who self-radicalize online through networks and by encountering propaganda that does in part come from groups. So it's not that the groups don't matter at all, but they matter in different ways. And I think that when we're thinking about disinformation and propaganda, it's all the more important to kind of understand the choose your own adventure kind of way that individuals are encountering propaganda, blending and creating these messy ideologies, and then taking action in ways that through calls, in this case, especially around January 6th, from political elites that call them to action. So the final takeaways, I think, for me, 3 final takeaways here are that 1, yes, the unifying problem, I think, is disinformation. 2, it's not only about the fringe, but just as much or more about better equipping the mainstream with the tools to recognize and build resilience. One of the things I often say is that, after 9/11, we got an entire agency in this country dedicated to risk and security, which is the Department of Homeland Security. What I would like to see is the same scale of response, not necessarily new agency, but that same scale of response dedicated to resilience to disinformation and propaganda. And that there's precedent for this, finally, the third point, in thinking of this as defensive democracy, that other countries have gone through things like this and have situated the fight against extremism as within the protection of democracy itself in ways that I think are powerful and important and mean that we don't need to entirely reinvent the wheel. So I will stop there.
Okay, so I imagine it's my turn. In the interest of brevity, I will make my points will be, yeah, they'll be kind of short because I'd like to open it up for further conversation. Thank you for the generous introduction, Professor Blum. I don't know this woman, never seen her before in my life. She's actually my colleague on a really pressing research matter on the MAGA movement, and she has been indispensable. I learned quite a bit from her. In fact, she even saved me this morning from some embarrassment. So thank you, Professor Blum. So I have 4 essential points I'd like to make. The first of which is people always want to say these MAGA people and Tea Partiers, they're crazy. Well, they're not crazy. I mean, they're crazy only in the sense that, the methods that they're using, right? Agree, those are extreme, right? No question about that. But your cat in the background is distracting me, Rachel. But they're extreme to the extent that the methods that they're using are kind of extreme, right? But beyond that, they're really rational. Like, what did Frederick Douglass once say? Power concedes nothing without demand, never has, never will. And these people are protecting the prestige of their social group, right? This idea that, the real Americans, if you will. And let me just give you an idea who the quote unquote real Americans are. White, male, middle class, native born, straight Christian. If one cannot check all of those boxes, one is not a real American. And so what they're trying to do is try to protect that group's prestige. And what some people will say is like, well, what about Michelle Bachmann? What about Sarah Palin, right? They're women, right? But they still buy into this stuff. Well, I wouldn't consider either one of them, or Phyllis Schlafly for that matter, a feminist. So let's just keep this 100%. So they're not crazy. They want to protect their group's prestige. So why do they buy into this? Why did they buy into the big lie? Why did they think that Obama was trying to destroy the country? Well, it's all about this concept called paranoid social cognition, right? Like Hofstadter, had this, we all know about this famous book he wrote, The Paranoid Style in American Politics. And he said very clearly in there, it wasn't about clinical paranoia. It's about this idea that things are changing so fast and so rapidly. These people that are in dominant positions, they don't know what to do. And so in the present case, they see things changing so rapidly in America that they feel like they're losing, quote unquote, their country. And they don't know what to do about it. They don't feel like it's their fault, but they're also feeling like, wait a second, the America that I've come to know and love is going bye-bye, through demographic change, through cultural change. And so we need to do everything and anything we can to try to retain that. And so that's why they buy into this stuff. So Trump is not, so what we see right now with, the deification, if you will, of Trump is not so much about him, but about what he represents. Trump represents the last thing standing between them and the rest of us. And by us, I mean to say progressives, people of color, feminists, etc. He is a vessel. This is not about Trump qua Trump. He's merely a vessel. So when we think about what happened on January 6th, this is not that was not about overturning an election because they were they were scared of Biden. It was about overturning an election so they can keep Trump in power, right? So the means, in other words, the ends justify the means. These people, furthermore, have always been here. And one other thing I would like to make is that people always want to conflate this simply with white nationalism or white supremacy. That is not the case. This is bigger than just race. Once again, this is about gender. This is about cultural change vis-a-vis same-sex lifestyles. Now, race and racism is the chief, I guess, it's the most important component of this mix, but this is not the only one. So third, these people have always been here. They're more visible now, for sure. We can trace that. We can trace this stuff all the way back to the Know Nothing Party, and then we can go to the Klan of the 1920s. Then we can go to the John Birch Society, 1950s and 1960s, the Tea Party, and now MAGA. So it's not like these people just popped up. This is not a sui generis movement, if you will. These people and this thought has always been around. And so the last point I want to make is, like, where do we go from here? We need, Steve, this conference could not be more timely given everything that we're seeing right now with the splintering of the continuing splintering of the Republican Party. You have the Trump faction, and then you got the faction that's headed up by Liz Cheney. And the Trump faction looks to be very, very powerful, right? I mean, everybody's buying into this stuff, right? And it's not like these public officials actually believe this stuff. They're doing it for cynical reasons for the most part. Louis Gohmert notwithstanding, right? They're doing, these other people know better. They're doing it because they want to retain power. And they're doing it because they're afraid of their constituents. They're doing it because their constituents believe, once again, that the America that they've come to know and love is going bye-bye. They will do anything and everything to preserve it, including violations of the rule of law. So for people that say that, oh, they're just really angry conservatives, right? Real conservatives are all about the observation of the rule of law. These people are not conservative. These people are reactionaries, driven by status threat. So what do we do going forward? Well, right now, these people constitute roughly, as Rachel and I have done in our research, roughly 50% of the Republicans in the mass public. 50%, 50, all right? It's roughly 10% that are in the Never Trump Lincoln Project camp, and then the rest of them are in the middle. So what do we do with these people? Well, first of all, I happen to believe, you guys can disagree, and I hope you do, because then we're just gonna have a talk. These people aren't going anyplace, right? They may go back into hiding, but they are going nowhere. So everything we see vis-a-vis political extremism and what's happening with the changing of the country, these people are going to remain here. They may become smaller as a group, but they're going to remain politically vital and powerful, at least for the rest of my lifetime, which I hope is more than 20 years. So these people aren't going anyplace. So what can we do? We need to marginalize them politically. How do we marginalize them politically? We get the balance of these Republicans who were real establishment types, who really believe in America, who really believe that change is good, if not necessarily what they want, who really want to preserve the America that they've come to know and love. We need to get them to help marginalize the rest of these people. That's what needs to happen. And I can expand on this stuff in Q&A if people want to know my ideas on how to do this. So I will turn it now over to my esteemed colleague, Jacob.
All right, thank you so much. What an amazing set of presentations. And let me just offer a really heartfelt thanks to Steve and Michael and Jason for putting this together, and to Elise Cole and the others involved in the backroom logistics. And then finally, Kate, that was just a fascinating presentation. Thank you so much. So I'm gonna just put up a few slides because, well, there's a couple of reasons. One is, so first of all, give me the thumbs up if you can see them. All right. One is that this is paperback day. The paperback edition of Let Them Eat Tweets literally came out today. So so now if price has been your barrier, right, we've lowered it. But seriously, as Stephen knows, when he put together this conference, you know, Paul Pearson and I were really inspired by Daniel Ziblatt's work. And then in turn, I think we were trying to push it in a direction of thinking through this kind of relationship between a radicalized party elite and a radicalized party base. And I thought Kate's bottom-up, top-down perspective on a issue that's usually viewed solely through the lens of, you know, this sort of spontaneous outburst of social media anger, I think really drives home something that we all know, but I just don't think it's emphasized enough, that it takes both a kind of elite fomentation, at least in initial stages, and you know, what Chris is talking about, this kind of potentially reactionary group to create the kind of the level, both the level in terms of the numbers that Chris was talking about, and in terms of the extremism that Kate was talking about, the kind of level of backlash that we're talking about. And so I want to just sort of take us to the top-down part very briefly, because I think we have been talking mostly today about the bottom-up part. And the first thing to say is something that that I think doesn't get recognized enough, because we tend to think of the U.S. not in comparative perspective, right? American politics specialists like me are usually focused on the US. And we know that if you look at polarization patterns, that the parties have grown apart and that the Republican Party has moved farther right than the Democratic Party has moved left. But what's really striking in cross-national perspective is that the Republican Party looks a lot like, in terms of its issue positions, looks a lot like fringe right-wing parties in other countries. And this is a strange combination, right? You have a party that is, on the one hand, you know, the Mick Mulvaney, Mitch McConnell party of tax cuts for the rich and deregulation, and in general, right, a kind of agenda of upward redistribution and deregulation that has been part and parcel of the Republican Party, at least since the 1990s. But you also have this increasing emphasis on ethno-nationalist backlash, the kind of right-wing populism that that Kate and the others have talked about, that we can see in Europe, but we see within fringe right-wing parties. And that is, I think, a product of what Paul and I in our book called plutocratic populism. And one of the things that I think we didn't emphasize enough there, and in a panel, Chris sort of took us to task for this, and I agree with it, which is that the plutocratic side is losing control, basically, and that's a key theme of the Ziblatt argument, and it's a key theme that we emphasize. But I think the degree to which Trump has kind of laid bare the degree to which it's Trump and the Trump presidency and the response to it has laid bare the extent to which the base of the party is not animated by any of the policy priorities of the elite wing of the party is really striking. And so one thing that we tried to emphasize in our analysis was these groups that, I completely agree with Cynthia that groups are not the kind of key organizer of violence, but the groups that I'm thinking about are really important in the electoral realm. And they're groups like conservative right Christian organizations, the National Rifle Association, and here, I think we have to think about right-wing media and right-wing social media as having a group quality to it. And I'll come back to that in a moment. And those groups are different than the groups that are like the American Legislative Exchange Council, which, by the way, are quite happy to be pushing highly conservative gun legislation at the state level, so long as they can also push measures killing public sector unions and tax cuts for corporations. So even the groups on the plutocratic side are willing to dabble in the stuff on the right-wing populist side, especially vote rigging. But increasingly, it's the agenda of the extremist groups and the organization of the extremist groups that's driving a lot of the party. And these groups, I mean, I think it's really important to understand that even for those who didn't think, like Fox News commentators, who didn't think that they really were fomenting an insurrection, their major modus operandi for making profits in the case of much of right-wing media, or for just becoming a prominent leader in a network of right-wing groups and right-wing actors is organizational maintenance. Their organizational maintenance imperative is outrage stoking. And these groups develop this kind of community trust that Kate was talking about. And so I think we can see the ways in which these surrogate organizations have been kind of weaponized by two processes. One, the kind of ceding of power to them by Republicans who are trying to animate white voters more and more to keep in power. And then another process, right, is the extent to which the party is essentially outsourcing this outrage generation to a bunch of forces that have their own goals and imperatives, right? Or just not that interested in Mitch McConnell's agenda. And I think Chris is right. There's a lot there, but I think race is really at the heart of it. So it's hard to, John Boehner, everyone was quoting John Boehner because in his, in outtakes for his audiobook, he said, has my sharing been taken down? Okay, I'm not sure why. So anyway, I'll stop there. But anyway, everyone's sort of paying attention to John Boehner. I have this quote from him that was up on the screen, but I don't know if you guys can see it, where he said, "We fed the beast to ate us," and I think it's a very revealing quote. I was saying that the reason we remember John Boehner is because he has this new book out, and one of the outtakes of it, he's talking about like how he grew up in Ohio, and then he says, "Oh, and by the way, Ted Cruz." So John Boehner may well think that he's like this stand-up guy who has it. He's fighting the crazies. But if you go back and look at the development of the party, it was precisely people like Boehner who made this deal with the devil that led to Trump and led to the kind of dilemma that we see today.
Well, thank you to all of our panelists for these thoughtful remarks. I'm going to turn the floor back over to Dr. Starbird so she can respond to anything that the panelists have said that she'd like to talk about right now. In the meantime, if you have questions and have not already put them in the Q&A box, please do so, and we will get to those shortly.
This is exciting for me because I come from a discipline that doesn't do this very often, where we have the response to the talks and then a response to the response. So I'm not well practiced in this format, but it's really exciting to get these kinds of ideas flowing across different scholars. And I really, there's different pieces of each of your responses that I think were really interesting to me. Cynthia, the thinking about what makes people vulnerable and how these folks are, what the vulnerabilities are, and I guess I keep going to all these conferences and they're like, what do we do about it? What do we do about it? And there is this one thing with like, you can't do anything about it until we fix some of the problems that are making people vulnerable to these grievance-based cycles, and what does it mean to address them? And I think I kind of think of the problem as it's a wall that we need to pick out from different directions until it's going to come down, and it's not going to just be one thing. And certainly that perspective is part of what might be a solution, in the sense of like trying to make progress and alleviate some of these cycles. I don't necessarily think it's going to go fast enough to stop some of the toxic cycles that we have, and I'm not sure we're going to have a chance to fix some of those problems if things keep spinning the way they are. So while I think that that's probably an apt description of what the problems are, I don't necessarily see how the solutions are going to catch up to where we are right now, but that's perhaps an absence of my own imagination. I really like that thing about defensive democracy, the ideas of inoculation and things, and certainly when you started talking about the describing the folks that are involved in some of this, the sense of heroism, the fact that they're sort of bought in. It's definitely the kinds of things that we see in the data, and it's interesting to see how that resonates with your perspective on what the motivations are for people participating in some of these in these movements. Across all of you, I heard this kind of rhetoric of like, it's not Donald Trump, and I think I see a question about that too. I've often described this as like Donald Trump is a symptom of the problem, but not a cause. If it weren't him, it may be someone else who rises up. He was particularly good at participating in these cycles. I think he does have a real talent for that. I don't think we should say did. We don't know if he'll be given back his tools, but he had a real talent for that. But that there are others, I think, that will rise in his place and already are kind of fighting to figure out who's gonna be, at the top of this very unwieldy populist machine. So I heard that across and really resonated with those comments from all of you. Christopher, I really like when you said, these are not crazy people. These are not, mentally ill people. We all, in fact, many of us have family members who are part of these things. And we have this tendency to think about this movement and what's happening as people who are, crazy, very fringe. And I just don't see that in my day-to-day experience. And when I really look at the data and like, we really follow these people. I've been following some of the same accounts since 2014 and watch their progression. And, someone might call them a Russian troll or a bot or whatever. These are real people. And you can see their progression across these sets of ideas. I think, beginning to be covered in these conspiracy theories and just, drowning in this pervasive disinformation, I think it can be disorienting. I think it may lead to disorientation. In fact, I've felt that as a researcher looking at the content enough. But I don't necessarily, that wasn't what caused them to be in these spaces. And certainly, I think it's really damaging for us to think of those folks this way. They think of themselves as heroes, and they are really, we studied folks who really were convinced that their votes didn't count. And they went online and they put in their thing and they said, look, my vote is canceled, and they posted it online. Of course, it said their mail-in vote had been canceled when they voted in person, but they didn't catch that because they were misinterpreting the world through this lens. And so I think it's really important to both have empathy for the individuals, but understand that the collection is very toxic. And Jacob, I really like this tension in the thinking about the plutocratic populism versus the right-wing populism, and seeing that there's sort of, that they sowed the conditions for this machine to start churning. And I don't think the folks understand that they've lost control. And maybe they see they've lost control, they don't know what to do about it. And I think they're in a bind of not knowing. I mean, they don't feel like they can step out of it because clearly they'll be thrown off and the bus will run them over. But they don't really know what to do with it. So it really just interesting ideas to think about. And I guess I'll stop rambling and maybe we can get some specific questions. And thanks.
All right, thank you. I have a list of questions going here. I'm going to start with a question from John Sonnen about the military, law enforcement, and the January 6th Capitol riots. So in his question, he says, recent news reports about those who participated in the Capitol Hill riot have highlighted the military and law enforcement backgrounds of many rioters. In your research, have you made any observations about the overlap between military and law enforcement experience and ideological extremism? Do you think the armed services are particularly susceptible to extremist infiltration?
Well, I guess I could speak on that. I was in the military. Do I think they're particularly susceptible? I think that, I think in some ways there are, in the sense that they consider themselves, not all of them, but many of them, like these super patriots. And that one of the things that the military is very good at is indoctrinating one, to believe that, into this very sort of, instead of patriotic view of America, it's a very nationalist view of America. Because you have to, if you're going to war to potentially fight and die, you kind of have to believe your country is the best, right? And your way of life is the best. And it must be protected and defended, to the, all the, to include everything that one has to give, including one's own life. So I could see how that could be a slippery slope, into this sort of ideological extremism. But once again, a lot of these people don't know the difference between patriotism and nationalism. And there is a very fundamental and tangible difference between the two.
I can just add very quickly to that. On the extremist fringe side, there is a disproportionate role of veterans in military veterans in some of the extremist violence. And there are a couple different indicators of why that might be the case. One is one predictor is involuntary exit from the military. So we know that leaving, it doesn't have to be dishonorable discharge. Timothy McVeigh was honorably discharged, but didn't make it to the level that he wanted to. He had sort of failed out of trying to get into one of the elite corps. He was the Oklahoma City bomber, if folks don't remember. But he was a veteran. So, there are a lot of recruitment tactics going on from groups like the Oath Keepers and the 3%er movement to deliberately recruit from active duty and veteran groups as well. I say that the problem we have in the US is that there's very little, in fact, zero data transparency about it to the public or to civilian academics. So, Germany has its own dedicated military agency that's tasked just with rooting out extremism in the military. Not only do we not have, and then they have to be transparent about that to the public, how many cases, what the results of the investigations are. They have a public facing website. We not only don't have that, but it's, we're just after multiple hearings before Congress requesting that the data get collected and the transparency be there to the public. We're only finally now seeing, a military stand down from the Pentagon after January 6th and the first kind of acknowledgements that maybe there's a problem. But we don't know if it's just a few bad apples or anecdotal stories or a more systematic issue. We do know the vulnerabilities are there. But I am a little optimistic that we'll start to see more transparency. I know there's a lot of conversations happening about it in different agencies and also within the veteran community. So I think things are changing, but we're really behind the kind of data collection and transparency of a lot of other places on this issue.
From the social media data side, having looked and thinking about the vulnerabilities and just looking at the profiles for years, not just with the Stop Us Steal, our work goes back into 2016. We can see that the military or veteran profile is a very common profile in this space, both among real people. And then if we look back in 2016, a lot of with the Russian interference, they were enacting military and veteran profiles, and their messaging often appealed to military and veterans. So they perceived that as being a vulnerability for drawing people into some of their right-wing propaganda ecosystem. They had a bipartite strategy, and certainly the right-wing movement right now still has those elements. They took the Russian trolls out, but they were part of an ecosystem, and certainly we see military and veterans targeted, and among those that were present on January 6th, and also integrated into the militias, the militia groups that were there as well.
All right, I'll move on to the next question. This question is from an anonymous panelist. If Trump started out as just a vessel, do you think that's still the case? Or did he assume this cult-like status that other Republicans haven't risen to through stoking all this fear and fashioning himself as the sole protector of true Americans from those trying to destroy the country. Polling reveals that any challenges to Trump, e.g. impeachment, only embolden his followers' support of him or willingness to attack those who go after him. And again, I'll let you all kind of unmute yourselves and respond as you please.
I'll say just a few words. It's a great question. And, you know, we have a similar framing of it in our book, where we say Trump isn't the creator of these trends. He was kind of a product of them and then an intensifier of them. But I think there's something very important in what the questioner asked, which is about the sort of invulnerability, or even you might say the invulnerability of Trump, or even the degree to which he kind of was strengthened by attacks on him, right? And I think it relates to some degree to this idea that Cynthia was talking about persecution. But I think it also is a symptom of a party, right, that has lost the capacity to kind of put issues of policy and governance anywhere near the front of discussions. It's quite revealing in two respects, right? So one is, you know, toward the tail end of the Trump presidency, right, there, you know, was no, you know, despite the fact that Trump almost certainly would have been saved if there had been a more aggressive anti-COVID response and economic response. There just was no capacity within the GOP to do a lot of the serious governing that needed to be done to move forward. And it was just, COVID became a culture war. The other is, of course, post-election, right? The degree to which it's a series of kind of distractions, you know, Dr. Seuss, replacement theory, which are really powerful activators, but don't reflect much in the way of governance. And you're seeing the same story happening at the state level, where the main example of real governance is these voters, shall I say, voter restriction measures, let's say, to put it artfully. So that, I think, is a really important part of the story. The substitution of a kind of cult of personality in Trump was only possible because A, Trump wasn't really that interested in policy and he just wanted loyalty, and because the party as a whole is in this late stage, and unless it kind of, as Chris was saying, unless it kind of recaptures some agenda that is positive, right, it's going to be very hard to see it break away from this kind of litmus test: are you with him or against him, and whether it's Trump or his successors.
Okay, so
Any other?
yeah,
Go ahead.
I had my hand up. So yeah, so I think Jacob is right, but I will also add, just getting back to the original question about whether or not he's a vessel, or did he assume this cult-like status because he stoked fear, essentially. It's not an either or, it's more of an and but. It's kind of both. He is a vessel because he stoked these fears. And he stoked these fears and resentments like no one else, well, at least going back to, you know, the infamous politicians of the, you know, of the South, right? Like Bilbo and all those guys, right? Who were just really naked, you know, in what they said. Even George Wallace was kind of careful about how he framed these things, right? He wasn't as naked and as explicit as Trump has been. But Trump knew that this is what the people wanted. If we think about 2016, Ted Cruz was the favorite of the Tea Party. But even Cruz wouldn't say, as hard as it is to believe, what Trump said during those times, right? And Trump was saying everything that the people in the mass public, at least the reactionary mass public, he said everything that they'd been thinking all these years. Romney certainly didn't say these things. No one else prior to him, even Pat Buchanan, didn't go as far as Trump went. And so he's been able to become a vessel for this because he's been identified as someone who has the ability to stoke these latent fears and anxieties and anger in the mass public that's always been there, going all the way back to the founding of the Republic. Once again, I want to make this crystal clear. This is nothing new. This has always been here.
All right, we have time for one more question. There are many, many great ones that we're not going to get to, but this is from Stephen Rea, and it's about monetization. Of course, not all participants are motivated by money, but one of social media's biggest affordances is monetization and enabling grifters like MTG leveraging hashtag Stop the Steal for campaign fundraising. Where does monetization fit into the participatory disinformation framework? And what would this look like without monetization and/or opportunities for grifters?
That's a great question, and I have to admit that the view that I've had of this phenomenon doesn't necessarily always reveal that element very well. There are other, especially because a lot of the research we do relies on Twitter data, which is public, but doesn't have the same monetization kind of affordances as YouTube or Facebook and some of the other places. We've looked at this as sort of like there's three motivations. They're often integrated for participants, for intentional participants in the disinformation system, not necessarily the crowds who get caught up into it, but those are who are leveraging it for gain or exploiting it for gain. And those are clearly political gain. That can happen, whether it's political gain for yourself or just your party and something that you care about. There's reputational gain, just your account getting bigger, you gaining these sort of visibility. Some people, they don't even need to turn that into money. Just having that reputation gives them a sense of, it takes you to other places. So it doesn't mean you don't have to be selling something to get reputational gain. And then there's certainly financial gain for media outlets, for sure, all the hyper-partisan media. I didn't pull out the hyper-partisan media aspects of this, but like there's the same Gateway Pundit over and over again, Epoch Times. You can actually go look at sort of these media outlets that are driving a lot of these cycles as well. And some of them are doing it for political reasons, and some of them are doing it for financial reasons, and some of them are doing it for both. But certainly those three, so financial, reputational, and political, are intertwined. And they really, those dynamics change depending on which social media system you're looking at. But if you look at the ecosystem as a whole, clearly financial incentives are part of the drivers.
Oh, just to add one thing, I'm sorry, Cynthia, go ahead.
Well, no, that's all right. I can go. All right. Well, I'll quickly, I was going to say basically the same thing, which is that, we do look at a little bit at the grifters, but more at the influencers online. And the influencers, I think, are the reputational folks. One interesting thing I'll just add to that is that with the rise of the ability to become such an influencer online, particularly on YouTube, we've seen a lot more women's engagement in the far right extremist spectrum. And we also saw a lot more women engaged on January 6th. And so we had seen kind of similar kinds of mobilization of women in the Tea Party around the fragmentation or the decentralization of political engagement and the grassroots organizing, and allowing more women to kind of maintain these homemaker roles, but still locally organized instead of only through national networks. But the online ecosystem kind of took that to a whole new level. And so you have women engaging, issuing white baby challenges to have more white babies than they've had, and coming up with ways to co-opt and draw in what are called trad wives or traditional wives into a further far right ecosystem, kind of promoting and selling and marketing a version of nostalgic utopian past that fits in very well with this kind of restorative ideals around white supremacy, or around, making America great again itself, like that kind of MAGA type of propaganda. So I think that that's sort of what I would say, is that I think there's just that interesting additional gender dimension there about what happens, who's empowered in those spaces, and what does that mean to have that kind of language of empowerment linked. And then as a result, I think we're seeing more women's engagement across that entire spectrum.
I'll just say really quickly that we should not, that's kind of the bottom feeding of the right-wing media ecosystem. And we shouldn't forget about the sharks, right? Like Fox News' entire business model is about stoking outrage, and it's gotten more and more racialized over time. And there's so many social science, political science studies now that are showing that matters a lot. You know, whether it's like a half point that the Republicans get because of Fox, or a point, it matters. And that's just the effect at the margins, whereas there's more and more evidence that if you watch Fox versus, say, CNN, you're going to care about different things. You're going to think that the election was stolen if you watch Fox, and you're going to worry about COVID if you watch CNN. And there's an experimental analysis that Josh Kalla and David Brockman just did that shows the same people, if they switch them over to CNN, they change what they care about. And so that, I will stop just by saying that I think that the talk radio to Fox News kind of evolution had pioneered in many ways that were outrage for profit model that can then be turned into some, you know, can deliver a whole set of benefits, as Kate was saying, to a whole set of participants. But I don't think we should understate the role that the top of the feeding pyramid has, not least because people like Paul Ryan go off to become, you know, Paul Ryan is, you would think he's like this right establishment Republican, and yet he then gets on the board of Fox News and leaves Janesville, which he said he would never do. So anyway, I'll stop there, but I just want to, I do think we should understand its role in this conservative surrogate world.
All right, well, I'm going to hand this back to Steve Livingston, and we will wrap things up.
Thank you, everyone. And we are running on over time. I just have very quick observations. What a fantastic panel. Dr. Starbird, terrific job. I offered the charge at the top of this program saying that what we need to do as scholars is integrate the research that says we need to lead with technology with the research that says we need to focus on, as Chris Parker said, what's always been here, what's been here for a very long time, understand the social dynamics that are, I think, anyway, the bedrock, the foundation for the kinds of dynamics that we see play out on the platforms. So it isn't one or the other, it's a combination of both. And what this panel has done is highlight exactly that. So I'm very excited about that. You just hit the nail right on the head. Congratulations, Jacob, on the paperback version of your book. I should say that I was inspired to work on this conference, this workshop, because of reading Let Them Eat tweets. So it's apropos that this occasion marks also the publication of the paperback version. Thank you, everyone. It's been an extraordinary 2 days. We are over time, and so I will simply close by thanking everyone. And I look forward to seeing you more down the road and in person. So thank you very much. Take care. Bye-bye.